In the spring of 1941, the Italian Navy was one of the most sophisticated fleets on the planet. Their ships were fast, their sailors were proud, and their flagship was a masterpiece of engineering. But on the night of March 28th, that pride collided with a ghost. Welcome back to The Chosen Few. We just saw the Italian 10th Army evaporate in the sands of Libya, but while the land war was a disaster, the Italian Navy, the Regia Marina, believed the Mediterranean was still their sea. Admiral Angelo Iachino was out for blood. He was hunting British convoys with a massive force, centered around the battleship Vittorio Veneto. But he didn't know that the British had a secret weapon, radar. For the first time in history, one side could see in the dark, and the other was effectively blind. We're going to do things differently today. Instead of picking a number, I want you to pick one of the following ships. These are 5 of the most powerful vessels in the Italian fleet that night. The Italian Vanguard, Vittorio Veneto battleship, one of the heavy cruisers, Pola, Zara Fiume, or the destroyer Vittorio Alfieri. Pick your ship carefully, because within the next few hours, 3 of these ships will be gone. Not just sunk, but absolutely shredded at point-blank range by British battleships they couldn't even see. The casualty rates for this engagement are some of the most lopsided in naval history. Let's break down the numbers of the Night of the Ghosts. To understand the tragedy of Cape Matapan, you first have to understand the Regia Marina. Unlike the Italian 10th Army in the desert, which was often under-equipped and demoralized, the Italian Navy was the golden child of Mussolini's military. Their ships were some of the fastest in the world, beautifully designed, and manned by crews who believed they were the true successors to the Roman Navy. In late March 1941, Admiral Angelo Iachino led a formidable force into the waters south of Crete. His flagship was the Vittorio Veneto, a Littorio-class battleship that was, quite frankly, a beast. It carried 9 15-inch guns, and could outrun almost anything the British had. Escorting her were several heavy cruisers of the Zara-class, ships armored so heavily they were considered some of the best protected cruisers in existence. The Italians weren't just out for a cruise. They were on a mission to intercept British convoys reinforcing Greece. The Germans had pressured Iachino to act, promising him air cover from the Luftwaffe. But as many of you who follow military history know, promised air cover is often the first casualty of a failed operation. On the morning of March 28th, the Italian fleet made contact with a small group of British light cruisers. Iachino, confident in his 15-inch guns, opened fire. The British cruisers immediately turned and fled, trailing smoke. To Iachino, it looked like a classic rout. He gave chase, unaware that he was being lured directly into a trap set by the British Admiral Andrew Cunningham. While the Vittorio Veneto was chasing the British cruisers, the British were preparing a very different kind of attack. From the deck of the aircraft carrier HMS Formidable, a squadron of ferry Swordfish torpedo bombers took to the skies. Now, if you saw a Swordfish in 1941, you'd probably laugh. They were biplanes made of fabric and wire, affectionately called stringbags, because they looked like something from World War I. But in the hands of the Royal Navy, they were lethal. At 3:10 p.m., the first wave of Swordfish found the Italian fleet. They didn't have to sink the Vittorio Veneto, they just had to slow her down. A torpedo struck the flagship's stern, jamming her port propeller and causing her to take on 4,000 tons of water. For a moment, it looked like the Italian pride was going to be the main casualty of the day. The hit on the Pola. Iachino managed to get the Vittorio Veneto moving again, albeit at a reduced speed. He began a desperate retreat toward Italy, desperate to get under the umbrella of land-based air cover. But the British weren't done. At sunset, another wave of Swordfish attacked. In the fading light and the chaos of anti-aircraft fire, one torpedo found a new target. It struck the heavy cruiser Pola, one of the ships many of you might have picked at the start of this video. The hit didn't sink the Pola, but it did something worse. It knocked out all her electrical power and her boilers. The massive cruiser went dead in the water. Her guns couldn't move, her lights went out, and she began to drift aimlessly in the dark. This is where the casualty stats for the night begin to take shape. Iachino was now faced with a choice that would haunt Italian naval history. He could leave the Pola behind to be captured or sunk, or he could send help. The data suggested the British were far away. Italian aerial reconnaissance, which was notoriously poor, told him the British battleships were hundreds of miles to the east. Based on that information, Iachino made a fateful decision. He ordered the Zara and the Fiume, the Pola's sister ships, along with 4 destroyers, to turn back and tow the Pola home. He didn't know that Admiral Cunningham's battleships weren't hundreds of miles away. They were just miles behind them, closing the gap in total radio silence, guided by a technology the Italians didn't even know existed in the Mediterranean: radar. As the Zara and Fiume turned back into the darkness to save their sister, they weren't sailing into a rescue mission. They were sailing into a firing squad. It was 10 p.m. on March 28, 1941. The Mediterranean was pitch black. On the bridge of the Italian heavy cruiser Zara, Vice Admiral Carlo Cotonio was focused on one thing: finding the crippled Pola. He had no reason to believe any British heavy ships were nearby. His crews were at relaxed action stations. Some men were even on deck, peering into the gloom, trying to spot the dark silhouette of their sister ship. But while the Italians were squinting through binoculars, the British were looking with electrons. The radar invisible wall. Behind the Italians, 3 of the most powerful battleships in the Royal Navy, HMS Warspite, Borum, and Valiant, were closing the distance at full steam. They were equipped with the Type 279 radar. On their glowing green screens, the Italian cruisers appeared as bright, steady blips. The British knew the exact range, bearing, and speed of the Italians. The Italians didn't even know the British were in the same time zone. At 10:27 p.m., the distance between the British 15-inch guns and the Italian armor was down to just 3,800 yards. In naval terms, that is point-blank range. It's the equivalent of a professional boxer winding up for a knockout punch while the opponent is still looking for his mouthguard in the locker room. 6 minutes of annihilation. The British destroyer Greyhound suddenly snapped on its searchlights. The blinding white beams sliced through the night and landed squarely on the Fiume. For the Italian sailors, the transition from peaceful darkness to the glaring light of a searchlight was the last thing many of them ever saw. Seconds later, the British battleships opened fire. The 15-inch shells fired by the Warspite weighed nearly $875 text kg, about 1,930 pounds, each. They were traveling at hundreds of meters per second. When they hit the relatively thin armor of the Italian cruisers, they didn't just explode, they disintegrated the ship's structures. The Fiume. She was hit by 2 full broadsides from the Warspite and Valiant. In less than 5 minutes, she was a burning wreck. Her aft turret was blown clean off the ship and into the sea. The Zara, Admiral Cotonio's flagship, fared no better. Within moments of the first shell's landing, the Zara was a floating inferno. The bridge was devastated, and the ship's internal communications were severed instantly. The data of the strike. If you are tracking the survival rates for the ships you picked, the stats for this 5-minute window are horrifying. On the Fiume, the casualties weren't a slow climb, they were a vertical line. As the heavy cruisers burned, the 4 Italian destroyers in the screen tried to launch a desperate torpedo counterattack. But they were blinded by the same searchlights and overwhelmed by the secondary batteries of the British battleships. The Vittorio Alfieri, the destroyer some of you may have picked, was headed straight into the teeth of the British line. She managed to fire a few torpedoes, but she was quickly reduced to a sinking wreck by a hailstorm of smaller caliber shells. By 10:35 p.m., less than 10 minutes after the first searchlight turned on, the Italian cruiser division was no longer a fighting force. The Zara and Fiume were sinking, and the Vittorio Alfieri was gone. And the most haunting part? The Pola, the ship they had come to save, was still sitting just a few miles away in the darkness, her crew watching the horizon burn, still unaware of exactly what was happening to their brothers. While the Zara and the Fiume were being transformed into steel furnaces by British 15-inch shells, the heavy cruiser Pola, the very ship they had come to save, sat just a few miles away in eerie, silent darkness. Because her boilers were dead, the Pola was a cold, floating tomb. Her crew had spent the last few hours in total blackness, listening to the thunder of distant explosions. From their deck, they could see the horizon glowing orange with the funeral pyres of their sister ships. They knew help had been sent, and they knew that help was now gone. At around midnight, British destroyers, led by HMS Jervis, swept the area looking for survivors. They came across the massive, looming silhouette of the Pola. There has long been a historical rumour that the British found the Italian crew in a state of drunken chaos. The reality, as recorded by the boarding parties, was more tragic. The men were huddled together on deck, many of them suffering from hypothermia after jumping into the freezing water and climbing back aboard. They were demoralized, freezing, and had watched their entire world vanish in 10 minutes of gunfire. The British didn't want the ship. They didn't have the tugs to move her. After taking off the survivors, the destroyers Jervis and Nubian fired torpedoes into the Pola. At 4:03 a.m., the ship that started the disaster finally slipped beneath the waves. One of the most unusual data points in this battle happened the next morning. Admiral Cunningham, the British commander, was a hard-nosed sailor, but he was horrified by the number of Italian sailors left struggling in the water. Knowing that German aircraft would likely attack any British ship that stayed to pick up survivors, Cunningham did something unprecedented. He sent a radio message in the clear, unencrypted, directly to the Italian High Command in Rome. He gave them the exact coordinates of the survivors and promised that if the Italians sent a hospital ship, the British would not attack it. The Italians sent the hospital ship Gradisca, which eventually rescued hundreds more. Even in a war of deleted armies, there were moments where the human cost outweighed the strategic gain. This concludes our deep dive into the Night of the Ghosts. It's time to see if your ship made it through the darkness of March 28, 1941. Did you survive? If you were standing on the deck of the ship you chose at the start of this video, here is your fate. Vittorio Veneto survived the flagship, took a torpedo to the stern, but managed to limp back to Italy. You lived. Point 2. Pola sunk dead in the water after a torpedo hit, then finished off by British destroyers. Point 3. Zara sunk obliterated at point-blank range by 15-inch shells from HMS Warspite. Point 4. Fiume sunk shattered by 2 full broadsides in under 5 minutes. Point 5. Vittorio Alfieri sunk blown apart during a desperate counterattack against the British line. If you picked any ship other than the Vittorio Veneto, your journey with the Regia Marina ended that night in the freezing waters of the Mediterranean. The final casualty stats. For the chosen few, the data of Cape Matapan is perhaps the most lopsided in the history of naval warfare. When you compare the losses, it looks less like a battle and more like a systematic execution. Italian losses: 3 heavy cruisers, 2 destroyers, and 2,303 sailors killed. British losses: 0 ships and 3 airmen killed. That is a staggering 767 to 1 casualty ratio. One side lost an entire division of their best ships. The other side lost a single torpedo plane. So like we do every episode, I ask you to join us for a moment of reflection to think of those touched by war. Next time on The Chosen Few, the British are riding high. They've deleted the Italian 10th Army in the desert and shattered the Italian fleet at sea. It looks like the war in North Africa is over. But while the Royal Navy was counting their prisoners, a transport plane was touching down in Tripoli. On board was a man who didn't care about odds or logistics. Erwin Rommel has arrived, and he's bringing the Afrika Korps. Next time, we look at the Siege of Tobruk. The data: 14,000 Australians versus the Desert Fox. The duration: 240 days of constant bombardment. The question: how did a group of rats dug into the sand stop the most feared general in Germany? Did you pick the Vittorio Veneto and survive? Let me know in the comments below, and tell me if you're ready for the return to the desert. Don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss the data behind the legendary desert rats.